December 31st, 1944, just outside Bastogne. The trees stood silent, draped in frost and shadow. Snow clung to every branch like a warning, muffling footsteps, dulling the edge of the war. Somewhere out there in the mist and pine was a panther, and it was hunting. Private First Class Jim Weller crouched behind the crumbled brick corner of a Belgian barn, his breath fogging under the chin strap of his too-loose helmet. In his hands, a battered M1 bazooka, older than most of the squad. The paint was flaking. The wires had been patched with gum and wax paper, and just before sunrise, its trigger switch had started sticking. Weller was a replacement. 2 weeks in country, no combat experience before the Ardennes. He knew how to shoulder the launcher, how to aim it, how to load the rocket and shout backblast clear, like they taught at Fort Benning. What he didn't know, what no one told him, was how much your hands shake when you hear treads crunching frozen gravel 20 yards away. A deep mechanical growl rolled through the forest like thunder trapped in a metal drum, the Panther's V12 Maybach engine. Jim could feel it in the mud under his boots. He peeked around the corner just long enough to see the barrel swing past a distant hedgerow. Broad turret, sloped armor, high silhouette. No mistake. It was the real thing. "Hold fire," hissed Sergeant Coughlin from the ditch behind him. "Wait till it clears the gate." Jim nodded, fingers tightening around the tube's grip. The bazooka felt heavy, heavier than it should. Maybe it was just the cold. Maybe it was the fear. He glanced at Corporal Bates, already crouched by the fence line with another bazooka team, waiting to ambush the Panther once it rolled into view. Everything was lined up. Everything should have gone right. But nothing about that morning went the way it should. A branch snapped to the left. Jim flinched. Instinct took over. He spun halfway, raising the launcher not at the tank but toward the noise behind him. His boot slipped. The bazooka tilted. His finger twitched. Click. The round fired. Or tried to. What happened next was a blur. The backblast didn't roar, it spat. A weak cough of smoke and sparks, followed by a popping sound that didn't belong on any training range. The rocket didn't shoot forward. It hopped, backward, right out the rear of the launcher. It struck a mossy rock behind him, bounced, spun sideways into the air, and vanished over a snowbank. Everyone ducked. Jim froze. Oosh. Then, from beyond the snowbank, came the sound no one expected. Boom. A muted thud, followed by the metallic crunch of something very large colliding with something very hard. Silence. Then shouting in German. Then panic. Then engine sputtering. Then nothing. When they finally rose from cover, weapons raised, hearts pounding, what they saw made no sense. The Panther had spun nearly 90 degrees. Its left tread completely sheared off, smoke trickling from the rear wheel assembly. There was a gouge in the snow where something, the rocket, had landed behind it. It hadn't struck the turret. It hadn't pierced the armor. But somehow, incredibly, it had hit the weakest possible point, the exposed fuel line under the rear sprocket. A fluke, a miracle, a backward shot that hit the exact wrong place, or maybe the exact right one. Jim stood staring, bazooka still in hand, the tube blackened at both ends. Sergeant Coughlin stared at him like he'd just conjured artillery out of thin air. "You aimed the wrong damn way," he muttered. Jim opened his mouth, then closed it. Later, they would joke that Weller invented the reverse bazooka shot. Command would never believe it. The weapon was confiscated. The reports scrubbed. They wrote it off as artillery interference. But in that moment, when the Panther stopped cold from a rocket that shouldn't have launched, in a direction no one meant to aim, Private Jim Weller went from rookie to legend. And he never fired a bazooka again. Before we continue, if you're interested in the untold practical stories of World War II, hit subscribe. These stories changed warfare but never made it into official histories. The smoke hadn't even cleared when Sergeant Coughlin scrambled over the snowbank, carbine leveled. Jim followed, heart still thudding in his ears. What they found on the other side was more confusing than the sound of the explosion itself. A shallow crater no wider than a trash can lid marked the impact point. At its center was a dark scorch mark, still hissing faintly as steam curled from melted frost. But it wasn't just the hole. It was what lay around it: fragments of bark, shards of painted metal, a warped section of German track link scattered like confetti across the clearing. Something had torn upward from beneath, not just down from the sky. It made no sense. Rockets didn't ricochet like that. Not in this terrain. Not at that angle. Coughlin knelt down and brushed away the edges of the impact ring. His glove came back wet with blackened oil. Something blew underneath it, he muttered. But how? The Panther, some 30 yards ahead, hissed like an angry beast chained down. The engine had gone quiet, but its fans still whined intermittently, sputtering as if trying to stay alive. The rear drive wheel had been twisted off its axle. One of the crew members, helmetless, dazed, had stumbled out before vanishing into the woods, but the others hadn't reappeared. Bates' team was already flanking through the left. One of them lobbed a smoke grenade for cover. They weren't taking chances. The Panther still looked dangerous. Jim didn't move. His eyes were locked on something glinting near the crater, a jagged piece of brass. A tail fin. He picked it up carefully and realized it was his. The back end of the bazooka rocket. Charred, slightly bent, but unmistakable. It had gone backward, somehow detonated mid-spin, and skipped across the ice like a river stone, until by sheer geometry and luck, it had wedged beneath the Panther's left rear and exploded directly under the drive assembly. Coughlin stood and exhaled hard through his nose. "This'll sound insane in the after-action report." "It already is insane," muttered Jim. He held up the tail fin. "You think it cooked off?" The sergeant eyed the launcher, still slung over Jim's shoulder. "You been cleaning that thing properly?" Jim looked down. "Honestly, sir, it's kind of borrowed." Coughlin blinked. "Borrowed?" "Swapped it with a guy from B Company for a dry pair of socks 2 days ago." That drew a look half disbelief, half resignation. But before Coughlin could say anything, a shout came from Bates' team. "All clear. The crew's gone. Tracks are toast. She's done." Relief washed over the clearing like a tide receding. For the first time in hours, Jim noticed how quiet the forest was. No gunfire, no engines, just the hiss of cooling metal and the crunch of boots on snow. The squad gathered around the crippled Panther, some staring, some swearing, all trying to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. Corporal Bates gave a low whistle. "I've seen 57 seconds bounce off these bastards from 300 yards, and you kill one by bouncing a rocket off a stump?" Jim opened his mouth to correct him, then thought better of it. "Yeah," he said finally, eyes still on the ruined tread. "Guess so." They spent the next 20 minutes securing the area. Intel would want photos. The Panther was mostly intact, aside from the destroyed drive system, perfect for reverse engineering or propaganda. A field camera team from HQ would probably be there by dusk. But before they moved out, Coughlin pulled Jim aside. "You realize," he said, voice low, "they'll never believe it." Jim didn't answer. "They'll write it up as lucky artillery. Or mines. Maybe even airstrike over spill. No one's gonna file a report that says round fired backward, took out a tank. I know. They'll take the launcher. I hope they do." Coughlin almost smiled. "You're not off the hook. You're carrying the bar until further notice." Jim winced. "That thing's heavy." "Not as heavy as a Panther." They turned and began walking back toward the rest of the squad, boots crunching softly in the melting snow. Behind them, the Panther sat frozen in the morning light smoke rising, tracks shattered, a 45-ton beast felled by the most ridiculous shot of the entire campaign. And somewhere deep in the trees, far from the battlefield, the German crew was probably still asking the same question Jim Weller would ask himself for years to come. How the hell did that even work? The debrief took place in a damp stone farmhouse that smelled of hay and boiled potatoes. It wasn't a proper HQ, just a temporary command post the battalion had commandeered outside Foy. A single bulb swung from the ceiling. The windows were fogged with condensation. Outside, the sun was setting behind frozen fields. Inside, Private Jim Weller sat stiff-backed on an overturned ammo crate, hands folded in his lap, staring at his mud-caked boots. Captain Leland stood across from him, flipping slowly through a clipboard of hastily typed pages. He hadn't spoken in almost a minute, which somehow made the room feel colder. "You're telling me," the captain said finally, "that you accidentally fired a 2.36-inch rocket backward?" Jim glanced up. "Yes, sir. It came out the rear of the tube." "Yes, sir. And then bounced off a rock. I think it was a stump, sir, with ice. And then ricocheted under a Panther tank and disabled it." "Yes, sir." Captain Leland looked at him. "Are you aware how that sounds?" "Yes, sir." "Stupid." There was a pause. Then, mercifully, the corner of Leland's mouth twitched. Stupid doesn't begin to cover it. Behind him, a second officer, a logistics major, snorted. He was there from Divisional Ordnance. They'd brought the damaged launcher in earlier, along with the remnants of the tail fin Jim had recovered. The major had already ruled the bazooka as severely compromised, with frayed wiring, warped alignment, and unpredictable backblast behavior. In short, unsafe. Jim didn't argue. He didn't even want it back. "What I don't get," the major said now, turning to Leland, "is why you're even entertaining this. There was artillery active all morning. One stray shell and boom tanks dead. Simple." Captain Leland didn't respond. Instead, he opened the manila folder on the table and slid out a photograph, black and white, grainy, taken from the side of the road. It showed the Panther, crippled, its left track blown free. The rear of the hull was visibly ruptured, the sprocket hanging like a broken tooth. But what caught the eye was the perfectly circular scorch mark in the snow behind it, about 4 feet behind the tank's rear end. The impact crater. "The artillery didn't land here," Leland said quietly. "This was the first explosion. Every other shell landed west, by the tree line." The major shifted. "Could be a mine. There were no mines in that zone. We cleared it 3 days ago. We ran wire and dug." Leland looked up again. "And this?" He tapped the photo. "Matches the tail assembly from the launcher Weller was carrying. Serial numbers still half intact." The major grunted. "Still, it's an accident. Shouldn't have happened. He shouldn't have been issued a defective launcher in the first place. If the rocket had cooked off inside the tube, we'd be writing up a fatality, not a kill." Jim stayed silent. That thought had already looped in his mind a dozen times. Captain Leland turned back to Jim. "Why didn't you say anything earlier? About the weapon being borrowed? About the trigger acting funny?" "I didn't think it mattered, sir. I wasn't planning to use it that day. It was just for backup." "You planning to borrow any more launchers?" "No, sir." "Good." Leland stepped back, folded the file shut, and turned to the major. "Write it up however you want. As far as I'm concerned, that tank's dead, the kid's alive, and God wanted a laugh." With that, he picked up his helmet and walked out, boots crunching on the frost-dusted floorboards. The major sighed and gathered his things. "Don't expect a medal for this, son," he said without looking at Jim. "But also don't expect a court-martial. Paperwork's gonna bury this deeper than a foxhole in January." Jim stood. "Yes, sir." That night, as the wind howled across the Belgian countryside and the fire in the farmhouse stove burned low, Jim lay awake in his bunk roll, eyes open, staring at the ceiling beams. He wasn't thinking about the court-martial that didn't happen. He wasn't thinking about the Panther or the blast. He was thinking about the 2-second hesitation, the stumble, the twitch in his finger, the accidental shot that shouldn't have happened, and the terrifying, unbelievable truth underneath it all. If he had fired the right way, if everything had gone according to training, they'd all be dead. By sunrise the next day, the story had already grown legs. It started in the chow line. A radio operator from Baker Company passed it to a wireman from Headquarters Battery. By the time it reached the mortar teams half a mile east of Bizary, it had ballooned into something else entirely. "Did you hear?" Someone whispered near the mess tent. "Some kid took out a Panther with the back end of a bazooka." "No way. Swear to God. Fired it backward, hit the damn thing in the rear and blew the tread off. That's not even physically possible. Tell that to the Panther." And so it spread. Across foxholes and fire pits, over tins of cold beans and mugs of burnt coffee, down frozen supply roads and up to observation posts overlooking the Ardennes treetops. Men repeated it not because it was true, but because it had to be. Something so absurd, so improbable, had to come from someone real. A first name at least. Maybe a face. Maybe even a serial number. Private Wheeler. No, it was Keller. Pretty sure the guy was from 101st. A medic, maybe? By the time it reached an officer with enough brass to care, the tale had mutated into this. A green replacement, barely out of basic, dropped his launcher in the snow. It misfired, launched the rocket backward, and the round bounced off a church bell, a tree stump, a frozen barrel, depending who you asked, before detonating under the engine block of a German Panther, stopping it dead during an ambush. The crew survived. The launcher didn't. No two retellings matched. Some said the kid cried after. Some said he walked away without blinking. Some said he was reassigned to a tank destroyer unit on the spot. None of them knew his name was Jim Weller. Jim, meanwhile, was still scraping mud from his boots and pulling patrols like everyone else. After the debrief, he'd been handed a new weapon, an M1 carbine this time, standard issue, and told to stay quiet. No commendation, no punishment. Just keep your mouth shut and your eyes open. So he did, but the world around him refused to forget. 3 days after the incident, his squad was pulled off the line for rest and resupply near Hemrul. That's when it happened. A young PFC from 502nd PIR wandered over, wide-eyed, holding a torn pack of Lucky Strikes and a tin of corned beef. "You guys know the kid who shot that Panther backward?" The whole fire team looked up. Jim was stirring his canteen cup. He didn't speak. "Yeah, I heard he's like cursed or something, or lucky, or both. You think he's real?" Sergeant Coughlin didn't even flinch. "He's real." The kid grinned. "For real?" "Yup." "What's his name?" Coughlin nodded toward Jim. "Ask him yourself." The paratrooper blinked. "Wait, you?" Jim looked up, deadpan. "Nope, just a cook." The kid stared, uncertain, then laughed and walked off, already telling the next guy in line that the hero might have been a cook after all. Coughlin leaned closer to the fire. "You gonna deny it forever?" Jim shrugged. "No one would believe the truth anyway." "You're not wrong." The flames popped, sending sparks skyward like tracer fire. Around them, voices murmured, boots stomped, radios hissed. The front never truly rested, not even in silence. What gnawed at Jim wasn't the story. It was the fact that, deep down, part of him wanted to believe it too, that something bigger had taken over in that moment. Fate, chance, whatever you called it. Because if it wasn't fate, if it was just luck, then next time, the luck might run out. Coughlin broke the silence again. "For what it's worth, the Panther's being shipped back." "What?" "HQ wants it intact. Gonna crate it up and haul it to Antwerp, then maybe across the channel. They want to study the damage, figure out what happened." Jim sipped his coffee. "Maybe they'll find out." Coughlin shook his head. "Maybe. But I doubt they'll find the part that matters." "What's that?" "You. With the launcher. Slipping." They sat in silence a while longer. That night, someone from S2 came by and took down Jim's name again. "For ballistics analysis," they said. He gave it without complaint. And when they asked if he remembered exactly what angle the launcher was facing when it went off, he just said, "Wrong one." Somewhere on the docks of Antwerp, beneath a cold November drizzle, a crane lowered its cables into the hold of an outbound freighter. Crate 147B was stamped in thick black ink across its side. Nothing flashy, just a number, like thousands of others leaving Europe that month. But unlike most, this one held what was left of a 45-ton German war machine, its rear hull twisted like a crushed beer can. The Panther's chassis had been partially dismantled, its engine ripped from the housing, drive sprockets detached, and all of it stuffed like a brutal puzzle into the wooden skeleton. A team of engineers from the 12th Army Group's Ordnance Corps had spent nearly a week cutting, measuring, and tagging every inch of its wounds. And at the center of it all was the crater 3 feet in diameter, lined with charred steel and stress fractures. Captain Elias from Ordnance crouched beside the hull, puffing on a damp cigarette. He was a quiet man, pale from long nights under bad lighting, and better at equations than explanations. His job wasn't to believe stories. It was to confirm or deny them with measurements and metallurgy. He tapped the edge of the rupture with a gloved finger. "Angle of entry's all wrong," he muttered. Behind him, Lieutenant Harper flipped through the latest field reports. No mine shrapnel, no he blast pattern, no consistent artillery arc. Elias stood, exhaling slowly. It's a directed impact. Something hit this. From low and behind. High velocity. Focused pressure. Rocket? Only thing that fits, but not from the front. From behind and under, like he trailed off. Like someone fired it the wrong way. Harper finished. They looked at each other. Neither smiled. Back in England, a few weeks later, pieces of the Panther sat in a cavernous depot just outside Reading. The British Ministry of Supply had requested access, claiming interest in Tiger and Panther vulnerabilities. What they got instead was a riddle. American engineers tried to recreate the event with scale models. They ran ballistic simulations. They even mounted a bazooka at reverse angles to see if backblast could project around. It couldn't. The rocket didn't have fins for rear launch. The propellant wouldn't fire backward. And yet there was the impact crater. There was the shattered gear casing. And the serial number etched into the scorched metal tail cap recovered from the snowfield still matched one batch. 14,790, 2 amperes, part of a late October munitions shipment sent to the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. Same batch Jim Weller's launcher had been carrying. By December, the wreck was packed away. Analysis ceased. Reports filed. Marked inconclusive. Crate 147B was eventually shipped stateside, destined for Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. There, it joined hundreds of other German wrecks in the Ordnance Boneyard. Technicians would walk past it for decades, unaware that it was once taken out not by a tank destroyer or a P-47, but by a rocket going the wrong way. Jim never knew where the Panther ended up. All he heard, weeks later, was that it had caused confusion upstairs. The day after the Panther was hauled off, he got reassigned nothing glamorous, just a routine squad transfer south toward Bastogne. New unit, new snow, same war. The story followed him, of course. Men who had never met him whispered about the backward bazooka guy. One even asked if he had a lucky charm, like a rabbit foot or a saint's medallion or something. Jim said no. But the truth was, ever since that morning, he had been keeping something. Tucked in the inside pocket of his field jacket, wrapped in oilcloth, was the tail fin, bent, blackened, still faintly reeking of cordite. It wasn't a souvenir. It was a reminder that sometimes the most ridiculous thing in the world could still be real. Late one night, after sentry duty, he pulled it out and turned it over in his hands. The edges were sharp. The casing was cracked. No one would believe this had changed the outcome of anything. And yet it had. He folded it back into the cloth and tucked it away again. A mile away, muffled artillery echoed against the trees. The war moved on. The men moved with it. But somewhere, buried in shipping manifests, debriefs, and mislabeled crates, was the truth. A Panther had been crippled by a backward shot. And no manual, no engineer, no officer in the world could explain how. The first time someone tried to write it down officially, the report got bounced. It came from the 12th Army Group's Ordnance Evaluation Team, technical, clean, with diagrams and coordinates. The language was careful. Unusual rear, detonation damage to German PZK-PFW, V Panther. Tank observed in Sector 43, B. The photos were black and white, attached with wax string, showing the fractured axle housing and ruptured lower hull. But the line that caused trouble came near the end. Probable cause: misdirected 2.36-inch rocket from U.S. infantry anti-tank launcher. Trajectory reversed from standard launch vector. The review officer underlined that sentence in red pencil, then scrawled 2 words in the margin. Not plausible. Because by the book, by every manual ever printed since the M1 bazooka entered combat, that just couldn't happen. The rocket was fin-stabilized, with a solid fuel motor that burned out almost immediately after launch. There were no guidance controls, no remote detonation, no reverse option. Firing it backward wouldn't just be ineffective, it would probably kill the user. Which meant, according to doctrine, Private Jim Weller should be dead. The Panther should be intact. And this story? Pure fantasy. But someone forgot to tell the snow. Back in Bastogne, Word of the backward bazooka had already hit the S4 logistics clerks and was trickling sideways into artillery batteries. The weird tale spread not as fact, but as friction, something that didn't quite fit, but refused to go away. Even in the barracks, where nobody trusted gossip, it kept popping up. In mailroom lines, over games of cards. A sergeant from 3rd Battalion said he knew a guy who saw the crater. A medic swore he'd treated the kid who fired it. By mid-December, the term Weller shot had entered unofficial slang. It meant anything that shouldn't work but did. A grenade that bounced twice and still went off. A mortar shell that jammed, then detonated after being kicked. An outnumbered patrol that somehow made it back with 0 casualties. Hell of a Weller shot, they'd say. Half smiling, half worried. Even Jim heard it. Once 2 new replacements whispering it after a lucky strike from a PIAT took out a German half-track. Neither of them knew he was standing a few feet away, digging through a ration crate. He didn't correct them. He just listened, finished his coffee, and moved on. But some people did try to figure it out. At a weapons depot outside Liège, 2 ordnance specialists ran informal experiments. They welded a broken bazooka tube to a test rig and fired dud rounds under extreme cold. The idea was simple. Simulate combat conditions, see what would happen with a degraded launcher. They tried wet powder, frozen igniters, fractured contact wires. Most of the time, the rockets didn't fire at all. Sometimes they sputtered, then fizzled. But once, just once, one of the rounds fired with partial propulsion, spun in place for a moment, then bounced off a crate and slammed into a sandbag wall backward. No detonation, but it left a mark. They took photos, wrote notes, and sent them up the chain. That file disappeared. Meanwhile, in the States, the Army was quietly testing new anti-tank systems. The 2.36-inch launcher, the M1A1 bazooka, was already showing its age. Against Tigers, Panthers, and even reinforced Panzer IVs, its punch was often too weak. Upgrades were coming. The M9, then the M20, super bazooka, capable of handling heavier rockets and sturdier backblast protection. But in a locked file cabinet somewhere at Aberdeen Proving Ground, one report sat misfiled under miscellaneous anomalies. It included a photocopy of a burned tail fin, a blurry field photo of a rear-blasted Panther, and a short type summary. Incident suggests non-standard detonation trajectory. Source: Centonust Airborne, 327th, Gier, Belgium sector. Weapon: infantry, at launcher. Outcome: enemy armor disabled. Status: unrepeatable, unexplainable, real. That word stuck. Real. Because no matter how many engineers scoffed, no matter how many manuals said no, the snow had the crater. The tank had the scar. And Jim Weller, quiet, average, forgettable Jim, had the launcher's burnt glove print etched into his palm for a week. He didn't need confirmation. He wasn't asking for it. But sometimes, on night watch, when the trees shifted under moonlight and every creak sounded like a German tread, he would reach into his jacket, feel the bent metal of that tail fin, and remind himself something impossible had already happened once. And maybe that was why he was still alive. It came wrapped in brown paper, tucked under the flap of a December mail bag, stamped with red ink. Personnel forward distribution only. The corner of the envelope was bent. The name on it, Weller, James M. Private was written in all caps, slightly crooked. No ceremony, no parade. Just a corporal with frostbitten fingers handing it over on his way past the foxholes near Foy. Package for you, he muttered, then disappeared into the trees. Jim didn't open it right away. It sat in his rucksack for almost a full day, while he and his squad dug into the frozen earth, fending off German probing attacks and guarding an icy ridgeline no one could name. But late that night, with the stars out and his boots steaming beside a tiny camp stove, he finally tore the paper. Inside was a medal, bronze star, and a letter for unusual initiative and courage under enemy fire, resulting in the neutralization of a superior armored threat and the preservation of American lives in direct combat. That was it. No mention of a bazooka, no mention of the Panther. No detail about angles, craters, or tail fins. Just sterile praise for an act even the army still couldn't explain. Jim turned it over in his hands. The ribbon was stiff, the metal cold. He held it for a moment, then set it aside and lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. Across the fire, Sergeant Coughlin didn't speak, just watched, then finally asked, "You gonna wear it?" Jim exhaled. Wouldn't know what to say if someone asked. Coughlin chuckled. "You never do." But Jim didn't laugh. His gaze lingered on the bronze medal, glinting faintly in the firelight. It felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with weight. What bothered him wasn't the recognition. It was that he hadn't done anything heroic, not the way people imagined. He hadn't charged a machine gun nest or thrown himself on a grenade. He'd slipped, misfired, fumbled, and somehow that mistake had saved a dozen lives. Now they wanted to pin a ribbon on it. Elsewhere, in some anonymous hallway in Paris, an adjutant major read the same citation and shook his head. "Bronze star for a misfire," he muttered, tossing the folder into a stack of after-action reports. War's got a funny sense of humor. But the truth was, no one knew what else to do with it. You couldn't reward luck, but you also couldn't ignore results. A Panther had been stopped. Lives had been saved. There were witnesses. There was wreckage. There was, technically, an act of heroism under fire. So the wheels of paperwork turned. A recommendation was typed, a signature secured. The citation mailed. Done. Back on the line, the medal drew more attention than Jim wanted. "Didn't take you for the medal type," someone joked. "Must have shot down a Stuka with a shovel," another added. Jim just smiled thinly, then stowed the medal deep in his duffel, between a can of shoe polish and a torn field guide. For him, the memory wasn't something to wear on a uniform. It was a moment, a blur of heat, smoke, and disbelief that didn't feel like valor. It felt like survival, and yet, something in him knew it meant more than that. Not because it proved he was a hero, but because it proved the rules could break, the impossible could happen, and sometimes the best you could do was stay on your feet and keep breathing, even when everything else said you shouldn't be. That night, a new replacement sat down near the stove, shivering and wide-eyed. "Is it true?" he asked quietly. "You're the guy who took out that Panther backwards?" Jim didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled a tin of coffee from his pack, poured a little into the kid's cup and said, "You believe in bad luck?" The kid blinked. I guess." Jim nodded. "Then you'd better believe in the other kind too." The fire crackled between them. No stories. No speech. Just the sound of boots in snow, distant artillery, and the silent knowledge that in war, sometimes the strangest things are the truest. Somewhere between Wilts and the Arth River, in a half-frozen trench line littered with shell casings and crumpled ration tins, the story finally began to slip the leash. Not as rumor, as doubt. For over a year, the German Panther had been the terror of tankers, the cold math of every tactical decision. Its frontal armor shrugged off most Allied rounds. Its 75mm K-42 cannon outranged the Shermans. Its silhouette, low and predatory, had haunted the dreams of more than one American crewman. To the average infantryman, it wasn't just a tank. It was a sentence. But after Foy, something changed. Not in the battlefield statistics, but in the whispers, the edges of talk where facts and morale blended. Not long after Jim Weller's accident, 2 more Panther tanks were found, knocked out in strange ways, one with its rear hull blown open by an errant 60mm mortar that ricocheted off a stone wall, the other immobilized by a mine placed under snow-covered mud by a Belgian resistance fighter using nothing more than a rusted spade and intuition. Individually, these events were anomalies. Together, they began to challenge the unspoken belief that the Panther was untouchable without direct fire from a tank destroyer or a flanking ambush. It wasn't that soldiers stopped fearing the Panther, but they stopped believing it was immortal. And in a war like this one, brutal, grinding, with every inch of ground paid for in frozen blood, belief was everything. A captain in the 502nd called it psychological air support. He meant the morale bump that came from stories like Weller's tales that didn't always hold up to technical scrutiny. but made the men lift their heads a little higher behind the hedgerows. When Panther myths began cracking, American squads pushed a little farther. They took shots they wouldn't have tried a month before. They tried, and that changed the rhythm of the fight. In a debrief near Bastogne, a corporal mentioned taking a frontal shot at a Panther with a recoilless rifle. Because if some guy with a backward bazooka can do it, hell, I might as well try. He missed, but 2 others hit. The tank burned. Even failure fed the fire. The Panther's aura wasn't built on fact. It was built on fear. Once that fear fractured, it spread faster than its own treads. Back at SHAEF headquarters in Reims, a colonel in intelligence noted an unusual trend in field reports. Fewer descriptions of Panther attacks, more of Panther kills. He underlined the phrase, morale impact, field narratives. No one used Jim's name. His story wasn't part of any press release, but it rippled quiet, odd, and unexplainable. Like the cold, like the war itself. Meanwhile, the Germans were dealing with their own illusions. To the Panzer crews, the Panther had always been a double-edged sword. Yes, it had armor and firepower, but it also had thin side plating, a vulnerable rear, and an overcomplicated final drive that snapped under pressure. When things worked, they worked well. When they didn't, they stranded entire units on the roadside, engines hissing, tracks frozen. The Panther wasn't a god. It was a machine, a fragile, temperamental one. But the Allies had spent too long treating it like legend. Now, slowly, that illusion was fading. One evening, Jim stood watch under a sky smeared with red-orange haze from distant fires. His squad was holed up in a bombed-out farmhouse near Vielsalm, halfway through thawing some potatoes over a wrecked German field stove. The new kid, the one who had asked about the backward shot, spoke up again. "You think they ever thought their tanks could lose?" Jim didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, he said, "I think they thought we'd never try." And that was the real crack in the myth. Not that the Panther could be killed, but that someone, some scared, tired, cold American with half a launcher and no clue would try anyway. Try when he wasn't supposed to. Try with no hope of success. Try because there was nothing left but instinct and the sliver of a chance. And somehow, that was worse for the enemy than any bazooka or bomb. Because machines can be repaired. But belief, once broken, that doesn't weld back so easily. The war didn't end with a bang for Jim Weller. It ended with paperwork. Spring arrived like a rumor, seeping through the torn canvas of tents and warming the bones of men who had forgotten what green looked like. The Ardennes mud thawed. Shellfire thinned. Patrols returned more often with nothing to report. And one day, almost as an afterthought, an order came through. Redeployment approved. Jim packed what little he had: dog tags, spare socks, a half-full tin of coffee, and the bronze star still tucked in its original envelope. The launcher was long gone, traded out for a standard-issue M1 carbine after the Bastogne push. No one had asked for his version of the bazooka back. No one ever filed a follow-up. That suited him just fine. There were no parades, no cheers. Just a slow convoy through ruined towns, a rail car back to Le Havre, and a troop ship that smelled like rust and relief. Somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, Jim stood alone on deck at dawn, holding the bent tail fin from that infamous rocket. He hadn't looked at it in weeks. It was just a piece of shrapnel, really scarred, blackened, almost unrecognizable. But to him, it was heavier than the metal. Because that twisted hunk of metal didn't come with ceremony or citations. It came with questions no one ever answered. He ran his thumb along the edge. It still had soot under the ridges. Still smelled faintly of burned cordite. Still felt impossible. He didn't keep it as proof. He kept it because he needed something to remind himself it had happened. Because the moment he stepped off that ship and onto the docks at New Jersey, the world started forgetting. At home, there were smiles, handshakes, and a banner someone strung up between 2 oak trees. "Welcome back, Jim." His mother cried. His father slapped his back and handed him a beer before he even crossed the porch. Neighbors came by with casseroles. The minister mentioned his name from the pulpit. But no one asked about the Panther. No one asked about the crater. No one asked how it felt to be in a foxhole, holding a launcher that shouldn't have worked and somehow did. And Jim wasn't about to bring it up. He fell back into farm life quietly: fence repair, tractor grease, planting season. His palms relearned the weight of tools instead of weapons. His boots stopped sinking into snow and started sinking into soil. At night, sometimes, he'd wake up suddenly, heart racing, half expecting a tiger tank to lurch over the next hill. But the roar in his ears was just wind against the barn. Years later, a historian reached out. The Army was compiling a set of exceptional battlefield accounts, an oral history project. Someone had dug up Jim's file, a citation with missing context, a tank kill with unusual parameters, a medal awarded with no formal after-action narrative. Would he be willing to talk? Jim said no. He didn't want his story turned into a curiosity. He didn't want his mistake turned into myth. And truth be told, he didn't even have a full explanation. Just a memory. White snow, black smoke, and a rocket that traveled the wrong way but still ended up exactly where it needed to go. On his shelf, in a wooden box next to a cracked photograph of his old squad, Jim kept exactly 3 things from the war. One was his bronze star, never polished. One was a folded page from a Time magazine article titled, "Panther Kill at Foy, One Man's Lucky Shot," with the margin scribbled out in red ink. And the last was that tail fin. He never told his kids the full story. Not really. Once, his son asked him what it was. Jim just said, "Something that shouldn't have worked." His son nodded and wandered off. And Jim smiled, not because he didn't want to tell the story, but because sometimes the stories that matter most are the ones we carry alone. Years passed. The war faded into black and white photographs and yellowing letters, buried in attics, stitched into stories told only when the fire burned low. Jim Weller didn't speak much about Europe. He didn't join the VFW, didn't wear his medal to parades, didn't write memoirs or pose for newspaper tributes. He preferred his cornrows straight, his wrenches clean, and his memories quiet. But that one shot, the backward shot, never quite left him. Sometimes, when the engine on the old Massey Ferguson sputtered, he'd glance at the box in the barn. Inside, a rusted tail fin, one corner bent where it had slammed into the frozen soil of the Ardennes. He never touched it much anymore. Just needed to know it was there. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. Because that shot wasn't just improbable, it was impossible. Bazookas didn't work that way. Rockets didn't spin around, clip a rock, skip backward, and find the soft underbelly of a 45-ton steel Predator. And yet, it had happened. He saw it. He heard it. He felt the shock wave ripple through the earth, and the silence that followed, a silence more deafening than the detonation. You could spend a lifetime trying to explain it. Some tried. Decades later, a tank historian at Fort Benning sent Jim a typed letter asking for details. The Panther had been a technical marvel, he wrote. The kill record in the sector showed a confirmed loss on that day, in that grid. But the angle, the entry point, the scorch marks, nothing matched. Would Jim be willing to elaborate? Jim wrote one line on the back of the letter and mailed it back. I aimed forward, it went backward, and the war moved on. In 1972, a visiting journalist from Stars and Stripes tracked Jim down. She wanted to include him in a special on unlikely heroes of the Bulge. She brought old maps, diagrams, even a blurry photo of a knocked-out panther half buried in snow. She asked him to walk her through it step by step. He offered her coffee and sat on the porch, hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. Then he said, "You know the difference between a story and a miracle?" She blinked. "What?" "A story has an answer," he said. "A miracle just happens." And that was all she got. Because Jim wasn't interested in analysis. He wasn't looking to be enshrined in some footnote of military theory. For him, the truth was simpler than all the diagrams and velocity charts. In war, things break. People die. Weapons misfire. Plans collapse. And every so often, something goes wrong in exactly the right way. He hadn't aimed for a miracle. He'd just squeezed the trigger. And somehow, the war gave him one. There's a field in Belgium now, not far from Foy. Most who pass it don't notice the gentle slope, the shallow crater near the tree line, or the rusting scrap metal half buried in the earth. Nature's taken most of it back, snowdrops in winter, clover in summer. But beneath that soil once stood a Panther tank. And beneath that, a mystery. Some visiting tour groups mention the lucky bazooka shot. Others call it a fluke. A few dismiss it altogether, just field lore, they say, nothing verifiable. But the men who were there, they never forgot. One of them, decades later, left a small metal plaque wedged into the bark of a nearby tree. No name, no unit. Just a phrase. Even steel can slip. Jim Weller passed away in his sleep at age 87, in the same Iowa farmhouse he returned to after the war. The bronze star was still in its envelope. The launcher tail fin remained in the barn, wrapped in oilcloth. At his funeral, the only reference to his service came in the pastor's eulogy. He was a quiet man who once stopped something unstoppable and never raised his voice about it. There was no fanfare, but among the mourners sat a man who had served in that same squad. And after the service, he told Jim's grandson the story about the launcher, the slip, the explosion, the silence. The boy asked, "But how could that even work?" The veteran smiled. "Don't ask how. Ask who. Because that shot, the one that shouldn't have worked, wasn't just about luck or angles or engineering. It was about a man who stayed calm when the world was burning, who trusted his instincts, who acted without hesitation, even when everything went wrong. And somehow, in the chaos of war, that was enough. One shot, one slip, 1 second that rewrote the rules. And in that second, a legend was born, not of glory, not of perfection, but of something deeper, courage, disguised as failure.